Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Family Weekend and the School of Public Affairs. I'm the Interim Dean, Allison Jacknowitz, and on behalf of the School of Public Affairs and the Sine Institute, I am pleased to welcome you to this panel. This is a special family weekend for SPA as it is part of our 90th anniversary. During our 90th, I have been highlighting pride points for our school, and one of those pride points is certainly the Women in Politics Institute. WPI is one of the nation's leading centers for political leadership training and scholarly research with a focus on how women can engage effectively in the political process. WPI offers graduate and undergraduate certificates in women policy and political leadership, provides training for those interested in running for office and leading a political campaign, and facilitates research to understand the challenges that women face in politics in the US. The Women in Politics Institute recently became the permanent home to Gender on the Ballot. I am now pleased to introduce the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute, Betsy Fischer Martin, who will moderate the panel. In addition to serving as Executive Director of WPI, Betsy Fischer Martin is an SPA Executive in Residence with the Department of Government. In the fall of 2023, she was a resident fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School Institute of Politics, where she conducted a weekly seminar on the presidential election. Prior to joining SPA, she spent over 20 years with NBC News. During this time, she served as executive producer of Meet the Press, as well as managing editor of NBC News political programming. I'm pleased to turn it over to Betsy.
Thank you. So great to be here with you all the parents and some students. I know I have some students from my class here, so welcome to you all as well. Wow, we've got a great panel for you all today to talk about the election. And I want to start on the end in the introductions with my partner in crime over here, Amy Dacey, who of course runs the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics here at American University, which is a treasure for everybody who is interested in following what's going on. She also did her master's here in political science at American University, yay. And she came back to AU after really a terrific career at the top of Democratic politics. She was the CEO of the Democratic National Committee and also the executive director of Emily's List, among many other things. So we're thrilled that she is here with us. Thank you, Amy. And to her right, literally, is Scott Jennings, who plays a Republican on television. I mean, he is a Republican on television. He is, of course, an analyst for CNN, and he has spent his career in Republican politics working on the Bush campaign, working in the Bush White House, also working for Mitch McConnell as a top advisor. So we're honored that he could be with us here today. So thank you, Scott. And then we have Zolan. Zolan Kano-Youngs is making his return appearance to AU because he was here 2 years ago when we did this panel about the midterms and was such a fan favorite. I had to twist his arm and get him to come back again. So we're delighted that he's here. He is White House correspondent for the New York Times, where he's obviously also covering this exciting election. He's been at the Times 5 years now, right, Zolan? So we're thrilled that he's here and can share some of his reporting with us all as well. And then Meredith McGraw is here. She is now an author of the new book, Trump in Exile. And we have copies here. We're gonna have a raffle. If you got a ticket, we're gonna do a raffle for some of her books that I think she'll be nice enough to sit around, stay around and sign for us. But Meredith is the national political correspondent at Politico, where she has been for several years now. Before that, she was at ABC News, and she has covered Republican politics, Trump, and the campaign, and we're excited to have her here to share her reporting as well. So great discussion tonight. We're gonna make sure to save some time for your questions, but I guess we'll just get started with, at this point where we are, and maybe Zolan, I'll start with you. We've got, what, 36 days left? How do you see the state of the race right now and what you're looking at?
Well, I mean, we're in a much different place than we were, at the beginning of this year, like even 4 months ago, right? We went from a race with a historically unpopular incumbent going up against a former president who was also unpopular as well, and a 77-year-old going up against an 81-year-old. So now we're in a different place. We now have, obviously, Vice President Kamala Harris going up against the former president at this point. Scott and I were just talking about it. At this point, I mean, there's very much, if you look at the issues of this election with the limited amount of time that we have left, I mean, you could say that, it's really one campaign that's based off of reproductive rights and abortion going up against another that's trying to spotlight the political vulnerabilities of incumbency, which tends to be the economy, and in this case, also immigration. Right now it seems like, and it really has been like this for months now, that if you are somebody who, that folks are baked in. If you are somebody who was, going to vote Democrat, you probably are. If you are somebody that's supporting Trump, you probably are. But at this point, in the past 6 months, I think this has been consistent. It really comes down to those folks who were thinking about staying home or actually going to the ballot. For Harris, who I cover, and the Biden administration, which I cover, I think the number one challenge is she is framing herself as a certain sort of change candidate. And I get that in some aspects. Obviously, you have the fact that she would be the first woman, the first Black woman to make it to the White House. Also, her career coming from an AG and a DEA vice president to now make it into the White House. But in many ways, she also represents incumbency. And, how can you differentiate yourself from a president that was struggling with his constituents when you also were in that White House? Thus far, we're seeing that the policy platform is, pretty similar with some differences. Child tax credit when it comes to scope, as well as a capital gains tax. But really, most of the changes are in tone. It really comes down to the messenger as well, which was, really a struggle for this White House beforehand. They had passed a lot, but how they messaged it was very difficult. And, Meredith will probably know better what the challenge is for the former president, but, I mean, I can count a number of them, right? I mean, a couple of legal challenges as well. And just a fact of whether or not this Republican Party, the current day Republican Party, maybe not the one Scott worked for, is going to, whether he will continue to have a grasp on it and whether he can get those folks to go to the polls too.
Well, Meredith, let me bring you in here with this because, the reporting in your book, first of all, this is the third time we're having Trump at the top of the Republican ticket. But how did we get, and this is the crucial, arc of your book, how we got from Trump in exile, Trump losing the election, to coming back full circle and being the nominee again. And then, talk a little bit about how he was able to do that.
Oh, how much time do we have? That could be a book, and it is.
It is.
No, I mean, so my book really starts at the end of the Trump presidency on January 20th, when President Biden is being sworn into the White House, and Donald Trump is taking his last flight on Air Force One down to Palm Beach. And it really was the political low point for him. He had just lost the 2020 election. The nation was still grappling with the COVID pandemic, the effect that had had on everyone's lives, the economy, and of course, January 6th too. And for Republicans in DC, Republican leadership, they were looking at Donald Trump and saying, sayonara, good luck. And there were a lot of questions about whether Donald Trump was going to continue to play a huge role in the Republican Party. Well, I know the book is called Trump in Exile, but that exile only lasted a very short amount of time. Yeah. And, the former president has and continues to have a real grip and stronghold on a core group of Republicans, his base. He was an incredible fundraiser for the party. And you know, he continued to play an important role in the midterm elections, which even though it didn't go as well as Republicans had hoped, he still continued to play just an important role in the GOP moving forward and really cast aside a lot of doubts, which there were some after he announced. I
mean, after the midterms and Ron DeSantis winning re-election by a long shot in Florida, I mean, there was a period of time in 2022, I mentioned when Zolan was here to do our midterm panel, that, you know, it wasn't looking so good for him to come back.
No, not at all. You know, DeSantis had just resoundingly won in Florida. There were questions if Donald Trump could actually pull this off. And, you know, after he announced his third run for president, he was slipping. He was, you know, he had the dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. He launched NFTs, and even people on Trump's own team were like, what is he doing? This does not seem like a candidate who's in control. But he quickly turned that around, went after DeSantis very early. I think with the Bragg indictment, the primary was really over before it even started. But, you know, now here we are. Donald Trump's running again for a third time. And just going off of what Zolan was saying, it's incredibly close. And, you know, when I'm looking forward in the next month, I'm just looking at these 7 battleground states. We can talk so much about the national polling, and we can talk a lot about where the base of the Democratic Party is or the Republican Party is, but it's really going to come down to an incredibly small but influential group of voters in these 7 states that haven't made up their mind. They are young, they're more diverse. We found in polling, or at least polling that I've seen, that they skew younger and male. And the big question is, are they going to actually get out and vote? Are they going to be motivated to come out this November?
Well, let me bring Amy into that, because she has just, in the Sine Institute, has just done a terrific new poll about the youth vote. And tell us the headlines, Amy, on what you found, whether there's going to be turnout, what young people care about the most in this election.
Yes, I'm excited to say this was our third annual poll on engaging youth, and it looked at young people ages 18 to 34 in the panel. You know, the first year we asked, what are their impressions of institutions? What are their impressions of government? Last year we asked them, you know, what is their American dream? This year we were asking, like, what do they want to see in their leaders? Which, you know, I think is essential for that engagement piece of that. Like, you know, we asked the question, are, like, you know, young people not engaged because they're not seeing what they want in their leaders. 83% said they were worried about the state of democracy. I mean, that was alarming. And I think that is not a partisan issue. That is just like everybody, you know, is concerned about kind of the direction that we're headed. So we saw that. What we also saw was that they were optimistic about their individual future, less optimistic about their community members, about their country going forward, which was an interesting, you know, we saw like a break there. We would assume that they would also, you know, feel that. But also they were looking for people with, you know, integrity and compassion. And they want people, if they've changed their mind or if they made a mistake, to just be authentic and honest, you know, about that. So, you know, we did an overlay certainly with people that are running, you know, in this current election. To be fair, it was right when Kamala Harris was, you know, assuming the nomination. But it was definitely, she had an advantage on some of those areas. But, you know, they saw both candidates as authentic in their own way, because how we use the name, you know, the word authenticity is different. But I think the other thing about engaging them is, you know, these moments that we have where people that they respect are, you know, weighing in. So the increases, you know, to your point about registration, and what does that mean if we're bringing in new voters who might not be included in some of this polling that we're seeing and that. But I think when you look at that, and we have plenty more information on the poll if you'd like to learn more. But we also, the really cool thing is that we had 11 students help us design the, you know, instrument, like do the analysis. And so we really had young voices in this project. But it was also an opportunity to look at, like, campaigns are really all the same. They are conversations with voters, you know, and what changes is who's having the conversation, what are they having the conversation about, and what are the tools, you know, available to us? Because each cycle that changes a little, you know. I mean, some of us worked on campaigns before there was social media and the internet. Like, I mean, the start, you know, I used to walk around with a roll of quarters in my pocket to call back my, you know, field reports. Can't believe I'm admitting that, but this is true, you know. But it's also, it's, you know, it's money. its message and its momentum in a lot of respects. And I think some of the things that, you know, we've been seeing, you know, right out of the gate when we're talking about the state of play is, you know, we have seen an influx, you know, of money. That doesn't always indicate, you know, that's the winning candidacy. I mean, certainly the Harris campaign has to do a lot more to introduce themselves. Yeah. I mean, the you know, Trump team has been spending money and, you know, has this advantage of being well known. But I think that's in play. I mean, I think Harris team is on track to raise, you know, $1 billion, you know, there's going to be $1 billion when you think about it. And when we all travel internationally, you look at individuals and you say, we're spending $1 billion on our races, that it blows, you know, their mind. And then the messaging, again, I would just mirror, you know, there are certain issues that, you know, these campaigns are driving, and they're not only at the top of the ticket. You know, I hope we get to some of these down ballot races as well. But I do think that this change in who the nominee is has helped with the momentum. And I think that's where you've seen the gap in the polling. That's where you've seen, you know, the influx of, you know, volunteers and, you know, people in the ground game as well. That's a little bit different. And just to remind everybody, I promise I'll hand this over to you in a minute. Just to remind everybody, you know, 4 years ago, we had a COVID campaign. I mean, the last time, it's been 8 years since we've had like this traditional campaign, which is different than 2016, yet the same, like so different from this COVID, you know, conversation we had and how we use voter engagement and what were the issues of the day.
Yeah. Well, Scott, let me bring you in here. Amy talked about momentum, and I guess Harris's momentum, has it leveled off? How do you see the state of play? And then also, what is the path for Trump to return to the White House?
Well, first of all, if I might compliment the panel, these journalists, Meredith and Zola, these, like when they write things, you should pay very close attention. I wouldn't say that about all of their colleagues, but these two, yes. Amy and I have known each other for a long time, and I think is probably one of the most skilled Democrat political operatives of the last generation. So good to be with you tonight. It has been an amazing cycle, because in 20, when we were on TV, we were all on our little boxes, stuck in our houses. We didn't get to go do anything. This year, in the TV business, I've gotten to go to both conventions. I met Hulk Hogan. I'm still imbued with the spirit of Hulkamania. It's a true story. I met him. He was nervous before he spoke. And I was like, Hulkster, I've been wanting to meet you for 40 years and you're nervous. And he said, I've never done politics, brother. And I said, yeah, I know. And I said, well, you body slammed Andre the Giant in front of 90,000 people. I think it'll be okay. And he did great. And so all the Republicans left Chicago, and they were very excited that they were going to win in a landslide. And then 3 days later, Biden dropped out. Then I went to the Democrat convention. I'm sorry, Milwaukee. Then I went to the Democrat convention in Chicago, and it was amazing. Literally every single person I met wanted to talk to me or get a picture with me, which is unusual for me as the Republican on CNN who's, you know, taking beatings with all the grace and dignity that you would expect me to take. And I was like, oh, I realize what's happening. This is our audience. Like, everyone here watches this network. And so they know me. And I had amazing conversations with people, but they too were so optimistic that they were going to win, because, you know, they thought they were dead. And now all of a sudden they have a new candidate. And so it was weird. Both conventions produced bases that were very optimistic.
It's like the sense of hope.
Yes, yeah. Which is for Republicans, you know, we're never ahead.
Yeah.
You know, the last time we won the national popular vote was when I was working for George W. Bush in 2004. Before that, anybody remember the last time before that? 1988. And unless your name is Bush, you're not winning the national popular vote. And so it was an unusual feeling for Republicans. So it's been a fun cycle to cover. I was at the debate in June when Biden had the meltdown and everybody realized a change probably needed to be made by the Democrats. That was a historic moment. You know, I think where we are today is Harris is slightly ahead. And by slightly, I mean she is one very statistically normal polling error away from losing every swing state. And so is Trump. And I think Republicans are kind of banking on the idea that he always overperforms, right? He did in 16, he did in 20. He just doesn't lose by as much as the polls think, because he has this group of people that turn out for him, as some of these men you talked about. And that's the secret elixir for Trump. Can you motivate higher turnout among low propensity and no propensity voters? If you ever wonder why Donald Trump spends so many Saturday nights at UFC fights, this is why. Because you have all these young men who, if they can get to turn out, he can change the composition of the electorate. That's the trick. And if he can do it, and if he goes into election night down 2 in the polling, probably going to win. But if he can't do it, it's going to be difficult. The path for him is very obvious. It's a 3-state campaign: Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina. He wins those 3, he's the president. Whoever wins Pennsylvania, 95% chance they're the president. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, 99.9% chance he's the president. So, and I actually think they're in better shape in Pennsylvania than they are in North Carolina right now. So to me, it's a 3-state campaign.
Yep.
You win those 3 in your home. If you're Harris, you win that Nebraska congressional district and you win the blue wall. You get to 270 on the nose.
Right.
And that's the campaign for her. So it's really no margin of error for her. And for Trump, it's a 3-state campaign.
Zolan, talk about the Harris campaign and outreach that they are doing or should be doing to Republican leaning / independents. As we speak right now, she's down at the border, right? And so what are they doing, and do they need to do more to appeal and move those numbers? Because it's not that many numbers we're talking about. Pick off some of those Republican leaning voters who may be turned off by Trump.
I mean, on a like 10,000 foot view,
Yeah.
just for independents, Republican leaning, just all voters. I think someone said, you know, Harris is introducing herself, right? And that's one important thing, because she can't allow right now, up until this point, the, you know, Republicans and the Trump campaign are very intent on sort of dictating what her career has been, right? I mean, you often hear about, you know, the shifting of positions on various issues. So she just needs to do the job of also introducing herself to the electorate and actually being clear on where she stands. You are seeing a specific focus when it comes to the demographic that you were just talking about. I saw that during her economic speech earlier this week, she was focusing on, look, the jobs that we've created are jobs that are also specifically for people that maybe also didn't go to college, that didn't have a 4-year college degree. I think one of the defining political trends that has not been talked about as much is the diploma divide, you know, over the past, say, 8 years, and seeing more college educated voters move to the Democratic Party and non-college educated voters moving towards Republicans. I think you're seeing the administration try, I don't know how much it's resonating, but try to sort of be back against that, particularly talking about apprenticeships and whatnot. And then the border, I mean, the border's tricky, right? Because if there's one issue where there's been such a pendulum shift, you know, in this country, particularly for the Democratic Party, I think it's immigration and the border. I mean, it's completely shifted to the right here. You know, I remember that around, like during the Trump administration, I covered the border pretty much exclusively and immigration. And I remember Democrats really criticizing the policies that are in the Senate bipartisan border bill that Harris and Biden before her are now advocating for. So just to catch you up, there's a Senate bill that the White House negotiates with the Senate, obviously. It would basically curtail, completely, like very much restrict asylum at the border. It would do a lot of the things that Republicans actually in Congress had been asking for during the Trump administration. I remember interviewing many of them for it. And, you know, Trump ends up, he doesn't want Biden to get an election year, you know, victory. So he tells people to basically tank it, to not vote for it. And now you're seeing, ever since that happened, the Biden campaign and now the Harris campaign has sort of tried to seize on that, to go on the offensive on immigration. And I'm not sure just how effective of a strategy that is yet. Trump just owns this issue rhetorically. He really does. And by going to the border like she is today to talk about the Senate border bill, to talk about the executive order that we reported she's actually getting ready to extend and make harder to lift, meaning that it will be harder to get asylum at the border, by taking this sort of enforcement-minded approach, she's also putting a spotlight on an issue that polls have shown voters trust Trump more on. So it's a tricky balance here. You know, she's trying to lean in and go on the offensive on border and migration to win over some of the voters that you're talking about. But at the same time, in the process, she's putting a spotlight on a political vulnerability that this administration has had consistently.
Right. And not one that she has a reputation for having handled well.
Well, I mean, right. I mean, she was tasked with this job. You know, the White House says that it was a diplomatic job. It had to do with raising money in Central America. You know, the Republicans have done a pretty effective job as saying she's a border czar. She was not, you know, exclusively in charge with managing border policy in the White House. It was Ali Mayorkas. But at the same time, right, like, she hasn't done herself much favors on this issue. When you're asked in an interview, when are you going to the border? And you say, well, I haven't been to Europe, in the Lester Holt interview, that not only resonated with voters, but I can tell you from my reporting, it's also something that really impacted her camp, you know, when she was a vice president. After that interview and that initial trip to Guatemala and then the border, or Guatemala, then Mexico, and then eventually the border, when she said, do not come in Guatemala, then the Lester Holt interview, she, you know, all the backlash that she took on that, she started to take almost like a risk-averse approach. She was almost overthinking each line in speeches. I reported at times that when her aides would bring her drafts of speeches, she was like pointing at certain lines and saying, well, is that gonna go viral? Is that gonna, you know, be on Fox News? Is that gonna be seized on? It's much different than the person that I see in the campaign today, which I think speaks to some of the success that she's had. But yeah, I think it's a tricky balancing act on immigration. I do.
Yeah, really interesting. Meredith, let me ask you about the vice presidential debate coming up next week, Tuesday night. And it is not lost on me that thinking about, you know, usually you say vice president picks don't really matter, but here we are with a Democratic nominee who was not elected by the party at all through a primary process and is the Democratic nominee only because she was picked by Vice President Biden. As you're looking at the debate, how important is that? Does it matter? And then also I wanted to ask you about sort of the J.D. Vance pick by Trump and what you think how that has affected the campaign, if at all.
Well, you're so right. Historically, the vice president pick is not something that people say really matters, yeah. But in this case, it is really important, but it's important for other reasons too. The vice president pick by a candidate, that's the first executive decision that the candidate is making and really sends a signal to the type of governing that they're going to do, what their priorities are, and of course, who they want joining them on the ticket. So in the case of J.D. Vance, who was chosen before President Biden stepped down from the ticket, Trump was really signaling that he wanted someone who could be a kind of MAGA heir apparent, who once he left the White House or he stepped away from politics, which I don't know will ever happen until maybe the day he dies, which is dark, but you know, Vance could be somebody who would pick up the mantle of MAGA and Trumpism. And he wasn't seen as somebody like a Senator Rubio or a Doug Burgum, who might have been more appealing to, say, people in the business community who have had some reservations about J.D. Vance and some of his positions, whether it's on, you know, the economy or whatever. And in the case of Walz, you know, Harris was going with someone that she, first of all, felt personally comfortable with. That was a big part of her decision-making, but also someone who would be complementary to the policies and her vision for a not Biden 2.0 administration. But you know, one thing I'm going to be looking at in this debate, and it's something that hasn't come up, but I think is so important, is, you know, Zolan smartly mentioned the diploma divide. What we're really looking at too is a historic gender divide. And we've watched how Senator Vance has turned off some women with his comments about abortion or childless cat ladies or whatever. And Walz, at the same time, the Harris campaign has really struggled with young men. And so I'm going to be looking at this debate to see if maybe both of them are going to try to appeal in different ways to men and women that both campaigns are really struggling with when you look at the polls.
And while you have the mic, let me ask you this too. If Trump does lose, what can we expect from him? Is there any way to know? well, if he would take the loss or not?
I mean, it's a great question. He has said that he wouldn't run in 2028 if he loses this election. But what a Trump loss would look like, how that would be handled by the party, if he loses, I think is sort of the next big political story.
Yeah. Let me get Scott to try to tackle that. What does a post-Trump Republican Party look like?
Yeah, I mean, it so much rides on the outcome of the election. You know, if Trump is the president, I don't think he'll run again either way. So you're going to be looking at an open seat, and JD Vance's role in that would be quite different if he were the sitting vice president versus, someone who's in the Senate from Ohio and had lost on a national ticket. So the outcome here really does make a difference. I do think it's important to understand how different the Republican Party is by constituency today. A lot of people with, that you would consider to be traditional Republican constituents, people over the age of 65, people with college degrees who live in the suburbs. There is some migration out towards the Democrats, and the in migration are working class Americans of all races. And this has changed the platform of the party. It's a more economically populist party. It's a more isolationist party. It's not as conservative. It's not as hostile to government spending. It's not as hostile to this, a big government doing things to avenge its, the enemies of its constituents. It's more anti-corporate than it used to be. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a harder time getting meetings with the Republican Party than it used to. And JD Vance is obviously the tip of the spear. So I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of people that I think are great Republicans that would make amazing, candidates for president. But so much of it rides on what happens to Trump here. I hate to, by the way, to disabuse you all of the watching CNN on Tuesday night, but I don't expect this debate. Anybody remember what happened at the last vice presidential debate? What's one thing you remember?
There was a fly.
The fly. You said it. That's right. That was the biggest star from the last debate, the fly. So I don't know what's going to happen at this one, but I have sincere doubts about whether it's going to move numbers. I think in our CNN poll this week, 88% of people said they'd already made up their mind it would not change. 12% said they were still looking at it. I think half of them are lying. So I'm doubtful about whether this is a game-changing moment.
Do you think Trump, though, real quick, though, do you think Trump will agree to debate again, or not a chance?
I wouldn't. He's had 7 debates. He lost 6. The one time he won, he was debating a corpse. So I don't think I would choose. I wouldn't look. What are you going to get out of it? There's like almost a 0% chance the snap polls would judge you to have won the debate, whatever that means. I think there's nothing to get out of it.
Right.
Now, this man makes a career out of making me look foolish for making predictions about him on television. So I don't know. I'm betting against it. I've counseled against it on TV. That's just my personal strategic opinion.
Yeah. Amy, let me get your thoughts on this, because you spend a lot of time thinking about, especially with young people, on advising them how they should be educating themselves about politics and policy. I was in an Uber today and kind of made the mistake of, when the Uber driver asked me what I did, told him I taught politics, and that opened up a half-hour conversation. But one of the things he said, which I thought was really interesting, he said, it's really hard to vote. And I thought, he can't get time off of work, or, all of the kind of logistical reasons. No. He meant that it's hard to know who to vote for. And I'm just wondering, for young people out there, especially, who maybe are confused, how do they think about making this decision? Where can they get more information? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting with this information explosion that somebody with it, we're almost over and inundated. But I do think that the challenge with that is that we've also had an increase in misinformation and disinformation from various sources. And sometimes I think for both sides of the aisle, just as a student of politics, there's a lot of outside voices outside the campaign telling us, where candidates don't always have control over that messaging. I think it is, first of all, like, just the process of voting. There's a lot of information out there, like, you have to make a plan to vote, right? It's not enough just to say, I'm going to pledge to vote. Like if somebody told me they pledged to vote, I'd be like, okay, great. But, we have to do this. About where to get the information, I do think there are valid sources. When I was first working in campaign politics, like we would put a message out there and people would come to it. And now we have to go where people consume individual, things. And a lot of time, and if you're a campaign operative, you're thinking about, there's a lot of talk about for young people, how the digital team with Harris is doing new and innovative things. And so where are people, gathering and consuming information? I think in some respects, that's why, debates should matter maybe, because they're the only opportunity you have to see the two candidates, whether they're presidential or vice presidential, on the stage at the same time, in this like supposed policy kind of debate, and are, hopefully fact checked on that. But I think the big thing is there are sources out there that kind of do the comparison between the two. I think you have to, look at what the campaigns are putting out themselves. I also think that where the strength and sometimes, the Democratic Party, and where we saw that was sometimes a challenge in 2020 is peer-to-peer conversations. Those are really influential in what people are, and how people get information. So a lot of times when you're working on a campaign, traditionally when I was working on campaigns, you'd have labor members talking to labor members, because that was something that was, you'd have community members, churches,
issue.
Yeah, churches for Republicans and Democrats have often been like sometimes an organizing, because people would, value and their community leaders. So finding those trusted sources can kind of help you, in that space. And then there's just places like there's really, great journalistic, integrity with a lot of the people we have obviously, here that are still, great institutions that have report the news, and I think the one thing that we have to also be very aware of is that, and I think a lot of these groups do a great job about it. There's punditry and then there's journalism, right? And so if you have to understand when some people are sharing their information, that's because they become from a certain perspective or, whatnot. And that's good to have, What
are you saying?
I'm not saying it's less valued. It's just, it's just like, but to see you and David Axelrod talk these issues out is important, because you're coming from a perspective, but at the same time, I respect both of them, but you're getting both sides of the story too. I think getting only one side,
out of your silos.
Did I dig myself out of that one pretty good? I can spin it. No, but honestly, there was a moment where I saw you engage with David on the stage, and it was kind of, it's always respectful, but it is like, we can have different, but how do you get to that? And so I think having that understanding, going to valid sources, and then I do think that peer-to-peer is really, important, and people that you know and trust, and we have to keep talking about it, right? Like, I think the biggest problem in this country is when I was growing up, it was like impolite to talk about politics and religion. And where are some of the most challenging places we find ourselves? In politics and religion. So I think having these conversations, we encourage them on campus to just talk through, like what is the case.
Exactly. Speaking of expressing your opinion and talking, we're going to have some questions from you all. But first, I think Allison is going to come up and do a quick little draw for some of our books while you're thinking of your questions.
Did you get a ticket? I didn't get a ticket.
Yeah. So get out your red raffle tickets.
All right. So our first winner is.
Oh, you got one too. So hold on. You can't win.
2386753.
Do we have a winner? There he is.
There you go.
Yay.
All right. Our second winner is 2386749.
There we go.
There we go. Our third winner is 2386655.
Must be sold on.
All right, I'll go to the next one, 2386719.
Oh, he had the 755. Okay. That's okay. We got it. We got a bunch.
And 719?
719.
All right, what about 685?
Oh, yeah.
All the way in the back. Yay. All right, we'll do 2 more now. All right, 2386733.
733.
Over there.
733.
And 2386684. 684. All right, I'll pick another one. Ending in 671. All right. We'll be back for more.
Some more. You still have a chance. We're going to do some questions. Do we have a question? Yes, sir. I'll be Oprah here.
I'm not going to pretend like I'm a swing voter. There's no point. But this is a question that I don't think that most voters are voting on, but I think certain voters are voting on it more specifically. Foreign affairs has been a controversial topic, whether it be Russia, Ukraine on the more Republican side having a more unpopular view, and then on the Democratic side, there's a lot of divides on Israel, Gaza. I guess my question is, there's also the concerns among people about democracy on the left, but then at the same time that they might be disagreeing on the Israel war and how that could affect things. I guess my question is, how do you think that really now affects the race now that we have a new nominee that's a little bit less plagued by the actual decision-making that Biden was?
Let's take that.
Sure, since you mentioned the new nominee, I mean, I think this is a kind of interesting dynamic. One, I don't think foreign policy will be one of the prime factors that determines the election. It just doesn't tend to be in a general. But I think you're right. I mean, this is a race about 3 states. And also when it comes to foreign policy, that really impacts a really important county in one of those states, such as Dearborn, Michigan, right? So it does matter. Harris has had a little bit of a different tone in terms of Israel and Gaza. There were times where we reported that in internal sort of White House meetings that she would be saying not to change policy, but to release statements talking more about Palestinian civilians and the death count. But what I think is interesting is that it's kind of emblematic of Harris's overall campaign, change in tone, but the same policy platform, right? I mean, again, this to me is like the central sort of challenge, or in a way, or tension with Harris is that, you're rhetorically different, but your policy platform does represent incumbency. So I interviewed Chris Coons about this at the DNC, as well as people close to Harris's campaign. I don't think you should expect something different as far as Israel and Gaza when it comes to Harris. And as far as Ukraine, I'd love to hear your view on this when it comes to the GOP side. As far as Ukraine, the problem for the challenge for the Democrats is, yes, they're going to continue to deliver aid as much as they can when it comes to, or at least when it comes to getting help from Congress. You saw Biden authorize about $5 billion yesterday. That was not new money, but just to get it out the door. But I do think there's rising skepticism amongst the American public of the amount of money that's going overseas. And what you saw was just rousing enthusiasm when the war first started for defending Ukraine and uniting the West. And I wonder how much they can keep that going at this point.
I'd just like to add that I think some of that is the substance of the issues, and we might not see that as the driving force for decisions, but this is such a leadership type issue, right? It's about, are you more diplomatic and or are you like tough on, world leaders and, dictators? Like, this is where I think they're trying to cast each other in different shadows about what their leadership style is like globally. We did see in our poll that not as many young Americans felt that our standing in the world was as strong, as it used to be.
I was surprised about that.
Yeah, it was a surprising statistic. And then I think it does go back to that leadership style. And so there's the substance, and some people might, vote on that, especially people who, have that global perspective. But how these two individuals approach the U.S. place in the world and how they'd approach leaders across the globe, I think is something that they're trying to.
Well, that goes to the difference between, the kind of traditional foreign policy base of working with allies, and isolationism, which is what Trump is, campaigning on, right? I mean, he is Would you say so? I mean,
oh, I think he is more prone to those rhetorical tendencies. He didn't operate that way as president necessarily, and I think his basic philosophy is keep him guessing, and which he would argue was successful given that he had a world relatively at peace, and now we have numerous problems. To me, I'll just take one quick vector on your question. I have been mortified and appalled at what I have seen on the streets of America and on college campuses regarding the conflict in the Middle East and the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. I think it's appalling. I think it's terrible. And I think it has reared its head in a way that everyone ought to be mortified by. And I'd like to see whoever wins take as strong a stance as possible against that, because I just think there's no place for that in America. We can have debates about foreign policy and what our role in the world should be in the Middle East and other places, but this is 2024, and we're seeing people running around, on some college campuses trying to block Jewish students from getting into certain buildings, and it's crazy. So I don't know that it's a foreign policy election, but I'll tell you this, it might be a turnout issue for Democrats who are trying to navigate this, because there are a significant number of people on the left who don't like it that the United States government has been more pro-Israel. So it's a good question. It's hard to quantify, but I think we've opened up some very raw nerves in this country on a critical issue, and we can't lose sight of that. Good question.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. We have parents here, and we've got a lot of young adults who maybe have political aspirations. So what advice can you give to them and us as parents to kind of guide them in the future?
Well, I'll start because my first campaign was 2000, and it's been the greatest career. I worked on campaigns at the state level, at the national level. I now comment on campaigns. My advice is, even though it seems like like you're just one step removed from being a carny, it's a terrific.
Okay, we agree on that.
It's a terrific. Amy knows what I'm talking about. It's a terrific way to learn how to solve problems in a high stakes environment, in a high pressure situation, on the fly at a very young age. The greatest thing about the career is that you get handed all this massive responsibility at an age when you really shouldn't be handed any responsibility. And so I don't mean that to denigrate you all, but I was once your age. I know I shouldn't have been handed any of this. And yet here I was out here helping, Mitch McConnell and George W. Bush do things. It was amazing. And so my advice is go intern for and/or find jobs on campaigns, and if you want a job in this profession, go get one. There's plenty to be had. And the number of doors that it will open for you almost instantly, even if you lose, are untold. And so it can be worrisome, like, oh, what if I get on a campaign and I lose? Put that out of your mind. Don't worry about it. Find somebody you love and work as hard as you can. I promise you it will all work out.
Amy, you weigh in on that. And
well, I would just say my first campaign was in 1979 because I was 8 years old, and my dad ran for school board. And my dad told me that all kids dropped lit on Saturdays and went to party meetings, and this is what was going on. And then I learned that was a lie. But I was one of those who got the bug very early on. So I grew up in a household but some of you that have, or some of you that haven't, I totally agree with Scott. I think it's, in some respects, it's actually a privilege to get up every day and work on something you're passionate about, when so many Americans out there, are working to live. And then I lived to work. I loved what I was doing. I respected and admired the people I did. I met people across the aisle. Cause when you work on those small campaigns, at the end of the day in November, you're getting drinks, with the campaign manager from the others. What do we do? What just happened? And a lot of times it can lead to great opportunities in government, as well, from that path. But I think that there's enough candidates out there. You can find, something that somebody who's working on an issue, or, is somebody that you, really agree and want to work for. I also think that I started out working for more local politicians because it was an access that I wanted. And that's what allowed me to kind of grow up in the ranks and, get to a national campaign in a lot of respects. And I also think when you get on a campaign, you can't be too literal about what you are assigned, to do. I think when you're done working, you should turn to any one of your colleagues and say, what can I help you with? Go to the press operation, go to the field operation. I mean, this is like an all hands on deck, but it's rewarding. And I do think that, and at the end of the day, it's very translatable no matter what you do. I mean, I have friends that went off and did different careers, but people saw this campaign experience and really valued it as well.
Meredith, can you talk about the career in political journalism?
Yeah. So, I will just start out by saying what an opportunity and gift it is that the students here are going to school in Washington, D.C., and just the amount of internships and opportunities and networking opportunities that you have as a young student that, kids across the country would love to have. And so I really encourage you to tap into all of that. When I was in college, I interned for my local congressman. It was David McKinley, a Republican in West Virginia, where I grew up. And it was his first year in the House. We went through 4 schedulers that summer on the Hill. It was pretty chaotic, but I continued to keep in touch with everybody in that office. And actually this morning I had breakfast with the chief of staff for Senator Capito's office. And he was a legislative affairs person in the office when I was a college intern. So it was cool to go back and see him have this major role on the Hill. And, I was running around and like collecting papers on Capitol Hill as a college intern. So I think the other thing I would say too is you never know where people are going to end up. And I always tell people that, treat people with the same amount of respect, the intern, the person that answers the phone, as you would the person, the senator or the congressman, because in Washington, D.C., as Scott was saying, there are young people who are given immense responsibility and who can, have a really quick career, and you never know who that person is going to be who helps your career. And in my case, that legislative affairs director that, I interned for in that West Virginia congressman's office, he recommended me for a few jobs, has connected me with different people over the years. So always keep that in mind. I went to grad school for journalism and then came to DC knowing that I wanted to cover politics. And the piece of advice that I really took to heart was raise your hand for as many things as you can and work weekends, which is a really unfortunate thing to say. I worked a lot of holidays and weekends, but I really felt like it was in those moments, especially I will say covering the Trump White House when a Saturday morning was sometimes a 5-alarm fire for the news, that I was given a lot of opportunities that I probably wouldn't have had otherwise. So those are just a few of my little pearls of wisdom from,
So Lon, do you want to talk a little bit about a career in journalism?
Sure,
Advice?
I'll make it quick so we can get to, I never thought I'd be close to anything politics. I'm going to be real. I was not one of these people who watched The West Wing growing up. Like I did not think I was going to be in DC. I just love journalism. I love telling stories, and I knew that I wanted to cover an institution that impacted people's lives and show readers how decisions are made, and then show the ripple effects of those decisions. But I think you can do that in any beat. I mean, my first beat was high school sports, then it was college sports. I had the privilege of covering the New York Jets for a bit. That was awful. And then I took an opportunity to cover the NYPD and criminal justice, and then made my way over to covering immigration under the Trump administration. I guess any advice I would give, if you're interested in some form of communication, writing, speaking, radio, TV, but writing does help. And you're interested in people, and, maybe you also have a little bit of an interest in having an impact, and setting the conversation, I really think, this is a great industry to go in. And don't worry about like what beat you're doing. You might just find that you become a White House correspondent and you really like it.
Let me just add one more thing for all the kids. It's the writing. Like,
that's right.
No matter whether you're an operative or a journalist or whatever, like, it's the writing. I also operate a public affairs firm. I have 25 employees. The only thing that ever matters to me is the writing. So my sincere advice is become the best writer. You'll never be without a job. I promise you. I care less about that. It's the writing.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am an elected official. I sit on a school board. Thank you. I sit on a local school board, and then I also sit on our state school board for the state of Iowa. So I'm going to push back just a little bit, talking about that Republicans are more prone to funding because the only two sources of funding from federal government are food nutrition and IDEA money. So I think there's some sunlight for food nutrition, maybe getting a little bit closer to the waiting for free and reduced lunching. I don't see anything of that happening with graduating towards that 40% promise for IDEA funding. So my question is, although my seat is nonpartisan, it is very clear that there is one party that supports private schools and there's one party that supports public schools. So Donald Trump has said that if he wins, he will eliminate the Department of Education. My question is, what do you forecast that seeing? What effect do you forecast that seeing on public education?
I haven't heard Trump say that, but I think for my part as Republican, I support both public and private schools. And I'm a product of public schools, Dawson Springs Independent Schools in Kentucky and the University of Louisville. And so I'm a public school advocate, but I'm also a school choice advocate, and so are many Republicans. And I think both can coexist. And should coexist, actually. I have 4 kids. 2 of them have learning differences. They have varying degrees of dyslexia and dysgraphia. The only place in Louisville where they can get the schooling that they need are a private school. So I have 2 of my kids that are in public school and then 2 that have gone through private education. It's truly the only place where they can get the reading education that they need. So when I hear people denigrate private schools, I think about my own kids and their own experience, and I needed to be able to choose between the 2, and public schools were fine for 2 and not fine for the other 2. And my personal view is I wouldn't want to deprive anybody of those choices, because I think there are a lot of parents dealing with learning more than we know. And if they had more choices, they might utilize them. It's my personal political view.
I think you're referring to the Project 2025, which, obviously many of Trump's former officials and allies worked on. And I believe that it was in Project 2025 saying that, not a termination, but just, very much, restricting, curtailing, divesting the Department of Education as well. And obviously this has been a line that, that Democrats are attaching to the former president, and they don't need to work too hard, right? Because you have many former officials, top officials for Trump that were working on that. So I think that was the connective tissue there too.
Okay, I think we are going to conclude it now. This is not going to come as a shock to anybody, but Scott has to do a CNN hit in the parking lot. I'm not kidding.
Anybody wants to come outside and watch Anderson Cooper slap me around for 15 minutes, you're welcome to join me.
So we're going to let Scott go, and then Allison is going to do the last of the raffle, right? And but joining me, please, in thanking our terrific panel tonight.